So the term neurodevelopmental disorder is kind of a huge umbrella term for many things. And while it does include dyspraxia, ADHD, and autism spectrum disorder, which are disorders I talk about a lot on this channel and what this video is about, it's also important to remember that it also includes other things that may or may not be related to, like tic disorders like Tourette syndrome and cerebral palsy and so on. So this video isn't specifically about neurodevelopmental disorders. In this video, what I'm going to do is talk more about the ones that are seen commonly alongside dyspraxia, because there has been a lot of misinformation that even I've been pushing in some of my earlier videos because I was misinformed. And after doing a little bit of research for a video that I was working on this past week, I found out that I was actually wrong about a lot of things. So in this video, I am going to touch on ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and how they play their roles with dyspraxia. Now, as many of you know, including many of my commenters, dyspraxia is very heavily a physical, cognitive, and motor thing. And so while it does affect neurologically, and it does play its role in certain parts of memory, working memory, and a little bit of impulsiveness, really the main focus of dyspraxia is either the social skills, the motor skills, or the cognitive skills. And it affects these things in such varying ways that dyspraxia never really affects two people the same way, especially when seen alongside ADHD, which is a genetic disorder, also a neurodevelopmental disorder, that affects attentiveness and impulsivity as well as behavior in general. ADHD is kind of weird because while it is heavily a cognitive disorder, especially when it comes to attentiveness, it's also somewhat showing shades of a personality disorder with its effects on human behavior and the impulsivity that seems to be super apparent with people with ADHD. Dyspraxia is really commonly seen alongside ADHD. It's estimated that about 50% of dyspraxics are also diagnosed with ADHD. And while dyspraxia plays its role of both verbal effects and cognitive effects, one of the biggest roles it plays is on memory, which can affect focus. And focus is the primary thing that ADHD tends to go after, and hence the inattentiveness. It's basically like being unable to focus on a single thing for a long period of time. And to some extent, I think everybody has this, but we all have varying levels of attentiveness in general, but I think with ADHD, it's kind of shortened to such an extent that the brain is practically always going 1,000 miles per hour, and that's kind of where the impulsivity comes from in ADHD as well. And while ADHD and dyspraxia both do have impulsivity to some extent, I think dyspraxia's is not as pertinent, simply because the impulsivity that comes with dyspraxia tends to come with just forgetting why you did something or why you're going to do something and then just going through and doing it anyway. Where with ADHD, it's more like your brain is going 1,000 miles per hour, so you can't really focus on one task. So you kind of just take the simplest task, which isn't always the good one. Both dyspraxia and ADHD are learning disorders too, and it's kind of hard to learn when on top of your memory, or at least your short-term memory, being relatively crap, your brain is also having trouble focusing on things to memorize on top of it. And it's understandable why that impulsivity tends to lead to certain addictions as well. And so, like I said in my video with substance abuse and dyspraxia, I wouldn't say dyspraxia plays as much of a role in impulsive behavior and addiction as ADHD might. And I feel like that's why we see a lot of these cases of drug abuse in individuals with ADHD. And to some extent it is understandable, because many times what these drugs are doing to these people is it's making the brain actually chill the hell out. And when you're going through ADHD or dyspraxia or anything like that for a long series of time, and you find something that makes your brain normal for once, it gives you some semblance of comfort, and you kind of end up turning to it. Autism spectrum disorders are a series of disorders that affect communication, sensory processing, and various other parts of functioning in the brain. And as such, it's really hard to define autism spectrum disorder as its own thing. And, well, like its title insists, it's really somewhat on a spectrum, depending on to what extreme it is affecting in the brain, if not more than one. One of the most prominent forms of autism spectrum disorder is Asperger's. And this is probably something we're all familiar with as individuals who use the internet on a regular basis. Now, while again, all these disorders kind of lay on a spectrum and can be affected in various different ways, the primary focus of Asperger's syndrome is on communication and social cues. And we can see how this is very similar to dyspraxia. I'll bring up that video real quick. The difference, however, is the mechanism of action as to why these social skills are being kind of hampered. And with Asperger's, it's somewhat, if not a little bit more harder to kind of manage than the social skills with dyspraxia. And so when you combine them, it just becomes this flurry of near impossible to understand speech that kind of goes all over the place. Then we have classic autism, which is a sensory processing focus. And because of that, it's basically an overload of information. And again, with dyspraxia, you can see, I'll bring up that video. With dyspraxia, there is also some semblance of this. And again, builds up a lot of the anxiety. And I can't point this out enough. I am giving very gross generalizations of these disorders because they are very prominent in the day-to-day lives of their sufferers, just like dyspraxia is. And I'm not trying to downplay dyspraxia either. I want to point that out. Essentially what's happening is these disorders affect very similar parts of the brain. And this is why we see comorbidity, because there may be various things affecting a small patch of the brain that, focuses on focus and also coordination and also memory. And so we very often see these things together. And essentially what we're doing with these disorders and such is kind of focusing in on the focus of each individual disorder and trying to deal with each thing and treat each thing as well as we possibly can without giving somebody something that they don't need, simply because that part of their disorder may not actually be affecting them. And this is why ADHD and dyspraxia are commonly argued as to whether or not they are on the autism spectrum. As it stands, I think the current consensus is that they're different, especially because they have separate mechanisms of action and different causes, or I guess dyspraxia, it's kind of hard to find a cause for as well. But in general, because they affect such similar parts of neurodevelopment, they tend to be lumped in together, and it's understandable to see why. But a lot of this misinformation and a lot of why we tend to use some of these terms interchangeably or falsely attribute certain things to being autism is because of a certain stigma that we've built up over time, especially thanks to the internet. I'm sure especially many of my fellow Redditors are aware of the term weaponized autism when referring to 4chan. And if you're aware of that, I'm pretty sure you guys know who Christian Weston Chandler is. But the thing to remember is that in any real selective group of people, there's always going to be a loud vocal minority that tends to make the silent majority look bad. This has caused such terms such as high-functioning autism to come into play, and, also referring to people with disabilities in general as autistic simply because they show certain signs of either mental or psychological instability that affects their coordination in some way. even though they may be dyspraxic, have ADHD, cerebral palsy, or even Down syndrome, which technically isn't really a part of the autism spectrum, at least not anymore. Down syndrome and alongside that Fragile X syndrome are actually genetic disabilities caused by genetic coding, and they are also intellectual disabilities, which means that they affect the intellect part of the brain more than the actual cognitive, and these are what you would consider a classical mental disorder. In fact, we used to use the now dated and demonetizable term of retarded or mentally retarded to, at the time, scientifically refer to people with intellectual disability. But just like how we use the term autistic now, we used to use retarded to refer to just about anyone who seemed to have some kind of neurodevelopmental disorder that was less physical and more cognitive and mental. And it's also important to remember that intellectual disabilities are obviously learning disorders and also neurodevelopmental disorders. And because of this, there usually is some comorbidity between autism and Down syndrome, but not everyone with Down syndrome has autism, and definitely not everyone with autism has Down syndrome. It is because of these societal and negative stigmas that are tied to these disorders that many of us with similar neurodevelopmental disorders like dyspraxia or even high functionally autistic people tend to go most of their lives, if not a large portion of their lives, trying to hide the fact that they have these disorders and trying to sway away help and trying to seem as independent as possible simply because they don't want that stigma attached to them. And, you know, it's kind of toxic. But eventually we make coming out videos like I did, and you know, that kind of worked out well for me. But again, I have dyspraxia and just dyspraxia. And the fact that I felt the need to delineate that when I made my coming out video kind of shows just how much that negative stigma around mental and cognitive health weighs down on certain individuals. And I'm not one of those extreme liberals that's trying to tell you what to say and what not to say. We all have freedom of agency and freedom of speech, and I don't think that should ever be encroached on. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that when somebody admits to having something like dyspraxia, dyslexia, autism, ADHD, try to at least give them the benefit of the doubt and try to talk to them like a regular human being without trying to question their intelligence at all, because all you're doing is just kind of making them feel like shit for having something they were born with and had no control over, especially when you could talk to them normally without making them seem like they're being pampered to some extent. But at the end of the day, this is a two-way street too. And having a neurodevelopmental disorder means accepting that you do have some limitations as well. And you need to be willing to bring that up to somebody so that they can accommodate you without trying to talk down to you because they don't know why you're not able to do what they want you to do or what they expect you to do. And that's really hard when you have communication issues like with Asperger's, but for the most part, if you can muster up the strength to bring it up to at least someone who can point it out to somebody else, or, you know, try to have some network or some sort of connection or something, because the miscommunication is what in turn leads to ignorance, and ignorance goes a long way in making people feel like shit. And well, just like everything, not everything's a negative, and with all these disorders, there's usually some positive spin to it. Like with ADHD, because of the impulsiveness and because of all the strange situations you end up getting yourself in, your life kind of becomes free entertainment. Sometimes it's a good thing though, sometimes it's a bad thing too. So, you know. And I'm sure we've all heard and seen it in all those, you know, documentaries and stuff, that people with autism spectrum disorder and people with intellectual disabilities tend to be some of the nicest and or some of the happiest people in the world. And if that's a negative, I don't want to live in a world where that's a negative. And a lot of that just comes with the culture we're living in too. It's so easy to wallow in self-pity and get those views and those clicks because that's what happens is if you're oppressed or you're, you know, suffering to some extent, you can always get the sympathy heat. But just like in professional wrestling, if everyone's getting sympathy heat, nobody's getting sympathy heat. If everybody got sympathy heat in professional wrestling, the whole thing would just look like a bunch of people beating up a bunch of disadvantaged people. And that's not okay. There's always going to be negatives and positives to every situation. And to just focus on the negative is basically changing your perception and everyone else's perception of you to that of something that is entirely negative. And you really get what you put into the world. And if you do come out with a good mindset or a positive mindset, usually things are going to turn out your way to some extent, or at least people are going to know you as someone who was always there, who was always chill, who was always happy, as opposed to, you know, another emo kid. Honestly, in any relationship or any situation in general, communication is key. Sometimes communication is hard to achieve, especially when you have one of these disorders. But at least trying to keep somewhat of a positive mindset on things will purvey somewhat of a good vibe and will eventually return back to you, almost like karma. And at the end of the day, if you really want a good picker up, just remember, as bad as things get sometimes, at least you're not a guest on the Jerry Springer Show. Thanks for watching, everyone. You guys have a good one.